So hi, everybody. Welcome. This is the Community-Based Research Training Center panel on building skills for community-based research, what you need to know before you start. So I just want to welcome everybody and start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Nehiyawak, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples on Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. I think it's always good to just give a little context for why to name territory. I think it's exceedingly important to what we do in community-based research and to the people in communities, and especially at this virtual time where we're all kind of feel like we're maybe floating, to really ground ourselves back into our responsibilities. So I'm Jeannie Kerr. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education, and I'm on the steering committee for the Community-Based Research Training Center, and I'm a co-investigator on the grant that funds the center. So I'll say CBRTC because it's a little faster, but it emerges from the Manitoba Research Alliance recent federal partnership grant through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, known as SSHRC, and this event is provided by the support of the Manitoba Research Alliance, SSHRC, University of Winnipeg Research Office, and the University of Manitoba First Center of Social Science Research and Policy. So today's panel event is part of a series this year aimed at students and interested faculty and community members about the fundamentals of community-based research. And if this is your first event with us, I hope it's one of many, and we would love to stay in touch with you and have you participate in all the events we've got coming up. So today our session is building skills for community-based research, building skills for community-based research, what you need to know before you start. So each of our panel members today, we're very fortunate that they have the time because they're very busy people, but they've dedicated the time to help us out today. They each have deep and diverse experience with community-based research. They're going to share their priorities today with you. So I'm going to pass this over to Dagen Perrott, who has been coordinating the work of the center since it started just not too long ago. I would remind you that we're being recorded, and that did come with your materials. So everybody should be aware of that, and that, govern yourself accordingly, however you like to do that. So I'm going to pass that over to Dagen. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeannie. And thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the panelists for sharing their time. It's very much appreciated. So I'll be sort of moderating today's discussion. If you have any questions at any point, I invite you to just put them in the chat box. We might not immediately get to them, but hopefully we should have a chance to, near the end, at least cover a few of them. As well, the recording will be going on to hopefully the Community-Based Research Training Center's website. We're still sort of figuring out where best for it to live, but yes, to answer the question in the chat already, it will be available at some point. And if anyone has concerns or anything, let me know and I can work around it as I edit that video. So yeah, happy to make sure it's fits for everyone. So to start with, I'm just going to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves, what they think is sort of important in their own introduction. And as well, if each panelist could just include sort of a short history of their connection to community-based research and how it's impacted your work. And Kathy, maybe I can get you to start us off.
Thank you. Ani, let's see, what do you want to know about me? First of all, I'm a grandmother of 4 grandchildren. My youngest is my granddaughter, who's 16, and my oldest is 33, maybe? Lost track. Anyway, I am 71 years old. I've been retired now for the last, will be 7 years on May the 1st. I've worked for well over 40 years in the Indigenous community here in Winnipeg. And I grew up here in Winnipeg. I was born here in 1949. And I went to school here in all the inner city schools for education. Went to the University of Manitoba and the University of Winnipeg. And I have an undergraduate degree in history. I'm also a member of the First Nation Fisher River Cree Nation, which is not too far from this way. North. And so that's pretty much me. And my history to do with research actually goes back to about 1991, or even further than that. But I will start with 1991 because it was the year that the AGI report came out, the Aboriginal Justice and Power report, which many of you may know a little bit about, or maybe not at all. Hard to say. And so when the AGI report came out, it was very much a report that was very important to us as an Indigenous community and an urban community. And at the time the report came out, I was working with the Original Women's Network, which is a resource center based at the Aboriginal Center on Main Street. I was the executive director there. And so when that report came out, there was a section there on women. And we also, our organization, the OWN, also made a presentation to the AGI. And so that's when we kind of started in terms of our piece to start thinking about research. The first research project that I was involved in was when I was with the OWN. And that was in we did the research in 1992. And it was called Black Eyes Forever. And the time of the study was, it took a couple of years. And it was called Black Eyes, I think I said. Black Eyes Are Forever. And it's about the whole issue of violence against women and family violence. And I like to say that was my very first positive experience that I've had with research, but it was also very negative. And I can talk a little bit more about that later, especially the negative piece of it all, because it also affected my future relationship with research and how research had to get done in the community. The second, the most recent one that I just finished happened in 2008, and it was called Preserving the History of Aboriginal Institutions in Winnipeg. We worked with Dr. John Loxley and Dr. Edward Peter on this particular research. It was very positive. It had all the elements of a positive research experience. I think we could also talk about later the OCAP principle, OCAP, and that involves ownership, control, access, and possession. Those are the basic principles that you need to know if you're going to be doing research in the Indigenous communities in Manitoba or anywhere else in Canada. And if you could also let me know, each one of you in your introduction to history, could you tell me a little bit if have you ever done any research in the Indigenous communities anywhere? It'd be interesting to hear a little bit of that so that I can get to understand where you're coming from. So that's just a little bit. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And the wealth of experience that you bring, I think is very much appreciated. Kirsten, if you want to go next.
Thank you, Dagen. Thanks for having me here. Hi, everybody. My name is Kirsten Bernas. I work at the West Central Women's Resource Center. I'm the director of housing there. That's kind of my main, the main way I spend my working days right now. But part of what, well, most of what I'm actually going to talk about today relates to the coalition work that I'm involved in. So in addition to working at West Central Women's Resource Center, I participate in 2 public policy advocacy coalitions. One is called Make Poverty History Manitoba, that I sit on the steering committee for, along with I think almost all of the other, Shauna and Lorie and Michael are all engaged on that steering committee as well. And the other coalition is the Right to Housing Coalition, and I chair the provincial working group of that coalition. And so those groups are focusing on public policy change around housing and poverty reduction, which is a really important to the work that we do at West Central Women's Resource Center. We are working directly with women in my programs, women who are experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness, living with low incomes. And so we're doing what we can to sort of support them very immediately on the ground, meeting their basic needs, connecting them to housing and income, and food security. And trying to do that in a way where we're also building capacity within them as people. But we also see the importance of public policy and the role that our governments play in, exacerbating the situations that they're in, or potentially, hopefully, improving those situations. And so there's a really important role for public policy around housing and poverty reduction in terms of achieving the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with our women in community at West Central Women's Resource Center. So that's why I'm able to participate in that coalition work and do that public policy work. And research has played a really important part of our advocacy there. And I'm going to talk about that today for the connection. So I'm going to give a really concrete example through the work that I've been involved in with Make Poverty History Manitoba. And it was actually my first connection to working here in Winnipeg. I grew up in Winnipeg, but went away to do my master's degree at Carleton University in Ottawa. And when I came back to Winnipeg, had already been familiar with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and was really connecting with the research that they were putting out around social justice issues. And so I went to the Winnipeg office when I moved back and connected with Shauna and Lynn, who were there. That was probably 10 years ago now, to see, how I could play any kind of role in the work that they were doing. And so Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives was sitting at this table that kind of became more formalized as Make Poverty History Manitoba. And at that time, they were really trying to push our provincial government to create a poverty reduction strategy, like a comprehensive plan to reduce poverty in Manitoba. There were other jurisdictions that had created poverty reduction legislation and started developing these comprehensive plans, and we didn't have that here. The folks that were part of that group at the time had done a bunch of work over several years, going out to communities across Manitoba and consulting with people on what our provincial government needs to do to reduce poverty in Manitoba, in the absence of our province actually doing that work in a comprehensive way and creating a plan. And so at that time that I had connected with CCPA, there was sort of this giant list of public policy recommendations that had come from communities across Manitoba around what the province could do to reduce poverty, but they weren't sure like how to use that and what we could do with that. And because of the role that the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative plays around doing research, there was the idea that we could take that and put that together, try to prioritize those recommendations, build on that to create a community-based poverty reduction plan for Manitoba. And maybe we could use that research report then to put additional pressure on the province to take some action. Yeah, the timing kind of worked out great for me because they needed somebody to help them do that work. And so I sort of connected with Shauna at CCPA and with the folks at Make Property History Manitoba to start to make this happen. And so we compiled all those recommendations that had been gathered through community consultations. It was a really long list. We organized them into different public policy areas, right? Like these are all ideas around housing, food security, childcare, etc. And we wanted to nail those or narrow those ideas down and prioritize. And so for that, we spoke with community and organizational leaders that had experience and knowledge in those different policy areas that we were looking at to find out if the recommendations that were gathered through these broader community consultations resonated with what they had been identifying in their work in the community. And then we also had this group of poverty reduction advocates that sat around the Make Property History Manitoba table, and that included people who had themselves experienced poverty, who kind of guided the research that we were doing and the development of this report, and provided input along the way. And this particular bit of research played a really important role in the advocacy work that Make Poverty History had been doing around poverty in Manitoba at the time, because like I said, the provincial government was not responding to community calls for a strategy, but they were made aware that this work was happening and that Make Poverty History was putting together this report, and they had developed all these ideas, and that there was going to be a public launch of this community-based plan. And it felt like it was going to increase the public pressure that would be put on it to respond in some way. And very shortly before Make Poverty History and CCPA launched that report, the province did launch its own strategy called All Aboard. So that was their response, and it was pretty far from what the community wanted in an ideal poverty reduction strategy for Manitoba, but it was a start. And it was like having that community plan and that research in that report really gave us something that we could compare the provincial plan to and push for a more robust strategy that would include more and stronger actions that were rooted in what people experiencing poverty and those working directly with them had identified as local solutions. And just a few years ago, Make Poverty History Manitoba kind of used a very similar strategy with the city of Winnipeg, wanting to see a municipal poverty reduction plan. And so we followed a very similar process, doing community consultation, gathering these local solutions, and created and launched the report Winnipeg Without Poverty, which provided Make Poverty History Manitoba with an opportunity to call on the city through the media attention that the launch received to create a city poverty reduction plan. And the city is now working with community and Make Poverty History Manitoba to develop its own strategy, and that's going to be released this year. So yeah, like both those examples, a community-based research process was really important to the success of the advocacy, right? And the people and the organizations who were engaged along the way as we were doing the consultations and connecting around the policy ideas, that they then wanted to also mobilize when it came time to take political action with that research and engage in the public policy advocacy work. It was like their participation in the process of developing the research gave them more of a stake in the outcome of the advocacy. And so they participated in our letter writing campaigns and, came out to City Hall when they were going to make a decision around doing the strategy, and, publicly endorsed the calls for these poverty reduction plans to be put in place. So that way of doing the research, I think, also really strengthened the advocacy in that way. And I think it also lends some credibility to the work that we did, because it obviously very much resonates with people who are experiencing the issues and can see the solutions directly. And to be able to demonstrate all the support that we were able to demonstrate from different organizations and people that had been involved, I think also provided some credibility to public policymakers and, impacted our ability to influence them to respond.
I think that was one of the coolest things entering like undergrad, was seeing the connection for myself between these campaigns that I was familiar with as someone who grew up in the inner city, and going, oh, this is something that my profs are connected to. This is what, there's connections here. There's a purpose to all this research. Thank you so much. Next, I want to jump to Lorie.
Sure. Thanks, Dagen. So my name's Lorie, and I'm the executive director at the West Central Women's Resource Center. So I work with Kirsten. I'm also a sessional instructor at the U of W in the Urban and Inner City Studies program. So I work with Shauna in that capacity. And as Kirsten mentioned, I am also part of the Make Poverty History Manitoba Steering Committee and have been for several years now. So I'm not originally from Winnipeg. I'm from Toronto, born and raised. I moved here about almost 12 years ago now. So I've been living and working in the inner city of Winnipeg for the last 12 years. And I still live downtown as well. So it's not just my work community, it's my home community. And I care deeply about the community that I live in. And I think for me, community-based research, it's an integral part of the way that we work at the center. And I'm going to talk about some different experiences than Kirsten, although I was part of the Winnipeg Without Poverty strategy as well. But wanted to give a bit of a different example. So the example that I'll use today is a project that we did through the center through funding from the federal government to look specifically at how to address gender-based homelessness. So the homelessness experienced by women, trans and non-binary folks, because their experiences are quite different. And most of the models that we have in this country are built around a man's experience of homelessness. So understanding how women and trans and non-binary folks experience homelessness differently was really important to us. And while we had some ideas as service providers and academics and researchers that were at the table, we knew we really couldn't understand that issue in the way it needed to be understood without talking to the people who had experienced homelessness and housing insecurity. And so that's actually where we started and where we finished the project. And I think the approach that we took to that, developing that strategy is a unique one, and one that I believe strongly in. So alongside our steering committee, which guided the work of the project and had about 20 or 25 or 30 service providers and policy folks and government representatives, et cetera, around the table, sort of all of the folks providing the supports, we had a second table that was our first voice advisory committee. And that was made up of women, trans and non-binary folks who they themselves experienced homelessness. And they guided where we started from, and they guided the project all the way through. And in order to make sure that we didn't get in our own way as service providers as we were developing the strategy, sometimes we hear something and we interpret it in a particular way, and then it finds its way into a report, but it doesn't quite hit the mark of what we were actually told. The way we worked to prevent that from happening is we actually gave our first voice advisory committee final say on everything that went into the report. So after we were done all the writing and research and had produced our recommendations, it went back to that first voice advisory committee to look at and read to make sure that we got it right. And when they recommended changes were made. And it wasn't until we had their sign off and their approval that we had gotten it right and that we'd actually delivered the message they wanted us to deliver, that we finally produced the report. And I think it's one of the documents that we're the most proud of at the center. And it's actually been used now in a number of ways to change the way funding is allocated in the city of Winnipeg. If you're doing gender-based housing work, it's now a criteria that you line up with the recommendations of our report, which is a pretty big accomplishment for us. But it continues to guide the work that we do at the center and the work that many other agencies throughout the city do. And I think the thing that makes that important and significant is because it really was developed by the people who most need those resources. So that to me is the value of community-based research. And yeah, that's why I'm here. Thanks, Dagen.
Thanks so much. And I love that, and that ties back to sort of what Kathy, you were bringing up of ownership and control of research. And that's definitely something I want to hear more from all the panelists on, because I think that's really important. Michael, I'd invite you to go next.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Dagen. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Barkman. I'm a settler here on Treaty 1 territory and a lifelong Winnipegger. Yeah, in some ways, I feel like I'm sort of still new to part of this conversation. Dagen, you mentioned that sort of stepping into the space when you really kind of at UIC and seeing all the connections and links, and yeah, to be on this with Kathy too, with you, hearing about your experience, and I've been a student listening to you, and same with you, Lorie and Kirsten. So I'm kind of stepping new into this conversation too, as a graduate from U of W about 4 years ago. I come from a family of like a ton of educators and a ton of teachers. So sort of research backing up what I had to say was always an important piece of my childhood, and sort of a value that continues to be imparted upon me by the many teachers I'm still surrounded with, and that sort of knowledge gathering and sharing. And then also came with that, like Lorie and the other panelists have mentioned, is a deep care for the community, the city I live in, and I'm a resident of the inner city. So that's really important to me, in addition to kind of caring about our movements for social or economic or environmental justice. Yeah, so I graduated from U of W with a political science degree in 2017, but really started taking some urban and inner city studies classes towards the end of my degree, and fell in love, wish that I found them earlier. Shauna was a prof of mine in addition to others. And it really just became so clear to me in the classrooms of the former classrooms of the UIC department before moving to Merchants Corner, how much community-based research was a huge part of the scholarly tradition sort of the department, so to speak. Yeah, it was something that really interested me and inspired me, and it was kind of some of the first moments of real deep engagement for me in my academic career. I work now at the Canadian Community Economic Development Network as the public policy coordinator. So it's a national network of organizations, community-based organizations, and then social economy enterprises, which we talk about as cooperatives or social enterprises, who are doing community economic development work. And my role is all about bringing our members together, which are groups like West Central Women's Resource Center, the North End Community Renewal Corporation, and so many other grassroots and community-based organizations, bringing them together and kind of coming up with a common policy agenda and policy mandate. And we have a democratic process to do that. And so much of our network's policy mandate, we have an annual event where people propose resolutions and we discuss them and sometimes debate them and come up with better ways to frame things. So much of that information is based on a huge tradition of community-based research to get to those resolutions as they're drafted. And then the rest of my work is all about working with coalitions and with networks to try and push forward those resolutions. So folks have mentioned involvement with Make Poverty History and a few other coalitions that I support both through my work and then also through some of my own volunteering organizing time, like with the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, which is another group I'm involved in. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know necessarily much to add to, but I'll speak a bit more to some of the other questions, but just that the community-based research, like I'm still sort of stepping into on like really on the shoulders of so much knowledge and information that has built up our field. And I actually think Winnipeg and the community that we're in is one of the strongest in the country for this work. And that's really clear in the work that I do at a national scale. And we talk about examples from Winnipeg and how well researched and connection with community-based research has done to advance that field. So yeah, honored to be continuing that work in this role that I'm in.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm personally just so excited to sort of hear your perspective as someone who's transitioned so recently out of the UW sphere of academia into the work. And then finally, Shauna, I'll just invite you to cap off our introductions.
Thanks, Dagen. So my name is Shauna MacKinnon, and I'm a professor at the Department of Urban and Inner City Studies. And the first time I ever did a community-based research project was back in 2005. I remember it distinctly. It was when when I first started working at Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I was the director there for a while. And we started a project, which is still going now, called the State of the Inner City Report. So we were, kind of venturing into doing that for the first time. And the first project, or one of the first projects I became involved in after that first year was a project called Is Participation Having an Impact? And I worked with, I think it was about 7 women now who are involved with an organization called Community-Led Organizations United Together. I'm just going to put the link to the report here. I think it's there. Because this was really the most participatory project I've ever worked on, and it was a difficult project. It was a time-consuming project. It took us probably a year just to figure out what we wanted to do, but the results were amazing, and we all learned a ton, and it was participatory from start to finish. It engaged all sorts of people in the community who had never done research before, and built the capacity of some of the women that we trained to do interviews. And what I learned from that was the importance of doing research in this different sort of way, where you spend a lot of time listening to what other people want to do. And that I wasn't a university academic at the time, but I was a researcher. And I realized that if you, as Kirsten commented on how people have a buy-in because they were involved, and this was what this project was like for me. Kathy made the comment about having bad experiences with research, and the women that I worked with were all Indigenous women who were running organizations in the inner city, who also were not too keen on research because they'd had some bad experiences. So, I took the direction from them. They demanded a different way of doing research. And so my job was to basically take the lead from them and get a sense of what they wanted to do, and then just basically do what they thought would be helpful. So it was very gratifying. I put this up there just because even if you look at this and near the end, there's a couple of stories, and one of them is Nancy's story. And if nothing else, it's worth reading a little bit about Nancy's story. So from there, it's really become the only way that I want to do research, because it's brought me in connection with a ton of people who do amazing work. I think it's a really valuable, it's underrated. A lot of people in academia still discount this type of research, but I think it's extremely valuable. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I've definitely just been so grateful to be in your classes and to have that be sort of the start to my experience in academia, is hearing you discuss community-based research and its importance. And so I'm grateful for your voice here. So to start off our discussion, I guess the broad question I want to invite is research in a fairly academic sense an important piece of advocacy, or a necessary piece of advocacy? And Kirsten, I know I had sort of cut you off as you were sort of answering that question. So maybe I can invite you to sort of start us off.
Sure, that's probably because I had put the answer to that question in that part of what I was saying, but I can kind of just try to summarize what I think, so the importance of using the community-based research process when we were developing those poverty reduction plans was really helpful in our advocacy for a few reasons. So one is that it gave us something to advocate for that we could say was rooted in local ideas, right? So we were advocating for government action around these local issues of poverty and homelessness, and the work that we did by speaking with people who are experiencing those issues directly and people who are working with them was to talk to them about you know, what those issues actually look like in our communities, and like what are the solutions that our governments can implement that are going to address the unique nature of the poverty and the housing insecurity that we experience in our communities. And so I think that really gave some credibility to the public policy asks that we were advocating for. So there was that piece of it that was just around like the value of the research itself and the like strength of it in terms of providing like sound public policy recommendations. And then the other piece was just that part that then like Shauna kind of echoed around their involvement in the research process made them more interested in playing a role in the advocacy and calling on the government to implement the ideas that they had put forward, right? And so we were able to demonstrate a lot of support. And when I say we, Make Poverty History Manitoba was able to demonstrate to the government, mostly through like advocacy or like organizing actions that we took to get our message out into the media, to demonstrate that there was, you know, a lot of support for the government to take these kinds of steps. So yeah, I think their participation along the way through the research then just carried forward when it came time to take action around that research.
So hopefully we can sort of lead into a more free form sort of back and forth around this question. So I don't know, Kathy, Michael, Lorie, or Shauna, if any of you want to kind of just jump in.
Can you just remind me the question again?
What is research an important piece of advocacy? And maybe sort of to expand on that, like how much buy-in is required from the community for that to happen?
It makes me chuckle when I hear that question now. I say that because, as many of you know, or maybe don't know, the Indigenous people of Canada, our history has been very positive with government for years. And Shauna mentioned the fact that when she got involved with us regarding our club group back in the 90s, I think it was, yeah, lots of us didn't care for research at that time because research was not our friend. It was not something that we used to help us advocate because it was hard even for us to meet with government officials who might, you know, change their attitudes towards us. And so we've always had this really struggle between our community and any kind of government official. So we had to find allies. And we found our allies also in the white community here in Winnipeg. It took many, many years to get there, to find those allies. And so in looking for those allies, we had to build trust. They had to learn to listen to us, okay? It was a big problem for them to really listen, to sit and listen and not just talk all the time. And so that was another thing that was problematic, but yet we took our time and we respected them in that way because we knew, you know, we knew a little bit about them as well. We really didn't know a lot about how the white community here in Winnipeg viewed us, right? But we knew the racism was there. We all experienced it as Indigenous people. And so we took it upon ourselves really to become very insulated back in the 80s, the 1980s, 1990s, because our community, we had to make ourselves strong in terms of our knowledge of who we were, in terms of our spiritual knowledge of who we were as urban people. Because a lot of us were born in Winnipeg. We're first generation urbanites. A lot of my people that I were my peers, they all came from either reserves, Métis communities, residential schools, all that stuff, eh? And then there's a lot of us, like I said, were born here in the city, raised here in the city. And so over the years, you get to meet a lot of folks in the various CBOs, organizations. And to build trust, we had to build trust with them. We had to build those bridges, you know, because we had to deal with a whole bunch of education things that we had to do. We were constantly going out into the public, to the white public, to talk about our issues, who we were, where we were coming from, you know, and it gets tiring after a while. You know, it's nice for the white folks to go out and talk about their allies they have in our community, you know. And so that relationship building and trust just went on and on throughout the years. Communication was so important. The media, you know, the work that we were doing in child welfare back in the 80s, into the 90s, the media actually became our friend and an ally for us. There were certain people in the media that became allies with us. As a matter of fact, we were called Flavor of the Month. Group of people, you know. So we had to educate some of the media people of who we were as well in order to, you know, gain that relationship. So my experience is totally different from what Kirsten talked about. In terms of all those things that they can do policies, they can, you know, talk to government folks and all that. We couldn't do that kind of activity because we didn't have that relationship, as I said, because of our history, colonization, the whole shebang. Anyways, it was good that this OCAP principles came up in the 90s because that sure helped us, you know, when First Nation communities and also us who live in the city here, those were important principles for us to practice. Even if we were going to do research within our own community, we wanted to do respectful and meaningful research. And the negative one that I talked about was that report that came out called Black Eyes All the Time about family violence and violence against Indigenous women. We worked with Resolve, that's based at the University of Manitoba. When I worked at the Original Ones Network, our resource center, we were the ones that got the funding from the 7th Generation Fund in the USA to get the money to do the research. We also got a little bit of money from the federal government and of course through the U of M Resolve. And the biggest issue for us at that time, the negative part of it, is who owns the research? That was the question we wanted to find out. It was our research. We did all the work in it. We had 5 other community organizations from our community were part of our group, our committee. And so that question, we had to get a lawyer to answer that question of who owns this research. Because you know what happened? The ladies that were involved was because at that time, we didn't have in our community, we didn't have our PhD folks. We didn't have our master's people in the university. Some of us had undergraduate degrees. And that was all we had. So we had to get a lawyer from the University of Manitoba. She was in the law faculty. And also she hired a student who was working on her master's degree. And for the people who did the interviews, we hired our own. We had our own women, we trained them so that they could talk to our women, our own women. So when the report was written up, both the lawyer and the master's student wrote the report, but we didn't have any input into the report. We don't even like the name black eyes all the time because a lot of us didn't have black eyes. At any rate, we didn't care for the report and the fact that they were going to deliver the report at a Canadian conference that was happening at UM on family violence against women. They were going to take our report, they were going to present it as theirs. So this ownership thing came up, owns the report. So we had a meeting with the head of the result and some of the ladies and our committee people. And I can tell you there was a lot of crying happening at that meeting because we demanded that, no, this is not your report, our report. And we're going to present it, not you guys. So what happens is, we went to the meeting, the conference, and they decided not to present because we were there physically. And then what happened is they actually wrote a book on this. It's sold on Amazon. Matter of fact, I didn't even know about the book until yesterday. So I ordered it from Amazon. I'll be getting it next week. And that's the evidence right there. If we had had OCAP, we would have had something to fight with the lawyers. They had their lawyer, we had our lawyer. And the lawyers, both of them said, no, the report's not yours. The research doesn't belong to you, it belongs to them. It belongs to the writer, people who wrote the report. That's what they based it on. So that was the real negative part of things. And a lot of those 5 groups that were part of our work there were also part of clubs. We had very negative. I went to Toronto a few months later to do a presentation. I forget which group it was. And I told them about the story, what happened to our research project. Because I could not say any names because I could have been sued, you know. And I didn't want to be sued. And so I just told them about the story. And the women came up to me after and said, I can't believe this is happening. This is like 1990s already. And this is what's going on in Winnipeg. Yeah, that's what's going on. You know, here we were. That was how many years ago? 20 years ago? What's going on? And look how far we've come. When you talk about Shauna, you talk about Dr. John Loxley and Evelyn Peter, you know, it just, they're so different than those people that we have to deal with when we did this study. 1995. We've come a long way, baby. Come a long way. And we've got lots of good allies now in the community. We worked hard to do that. Lots of good allies. And we've done lots of good things in Winnipeg. Yeah. So that's all I can say right now.
I think that's such an important reminder of like how much further also still needs to go, and that it's not just
Not a done deal yet.
Yeah, nor is it something you can just kind of imagine. It's through ongoing relationships and work and commitment.
We're open to that. We'll be working together. Always.
To sort of ask a follow-up question, if I may. So do you think with some of the newer research and some of these relationships that are building, is some of the research happening now helpful to the advocacy? Has it reached a point where it is something that's actually valuable to these to communities, or does it still have further to go?
I think it has a little further to go, and but it all depends. Like if folks use the principles of the First Nations OCAP principles, from Winnipeg here. We have a very large Indigenous community with lots of organizations here. These principles have to be followed. That relationship building is so important. Can't stress it anymore. And it takes a long time to build relationships. You've got to get to know people and who they are. See, like when I talk about who I am, I don't start with, well, this is the work I've done. That's not my identity. My identity does not relate to the work I've done. It relates to who I am as an Indigenous, Ojibwe, Cree woman, my family, my friends, my community. That's who I am. Not the work that I've done, because there's a whole bunch of people who were there with me, stood beside me, and also from the white community, they were there. Our allies were there. And the other thing, I think the last important thing that I can say to students out there listening, follow up. My God, that is so important. Follow up. Because if you don't do your follow up, you might as well just drop everything and just walk out, because you know what? If you don't follow up on what you said, what you promised to people, they're going to remember you. They'll remember you. Of course, the important thing is to listen. And that's what I'm going to do right now.
Speaking of follow-up, do any of the other panelists want to follow up on that? Or did it spark any further thought?
I think maybe just one piece I would add is that part of the value of research when we're doing advocacy is to test the theories that we draw or the conclusions that we draw from the information we receive. And I think particularly in community work, we have a responsibility to make sure that those conclusions that we've drawn are accurate. And I have had some opportunity to participate in some training around this notion called leading by design. And what it taught me really clearly was that often when we create a new problem, we create a new program, we identify a problem that we think our program will address, and then our evaluation of that program is really just meant to determine whether we achieved the outcome we set to achieve. But often that isn't the correct outcome. We've missed the mark on the outcome. So even if the evaluation shows us back that, yes, you achieved the outcome you set out to achieve, if the outcome was wrong in the first place, you actually haven't contributed to solving the problem. And so for me, what community-based research does is really grounds us in making sure that we get the outcomes right from the beginning, right? So if I look at a situation like housing and I say, well, you know, it's a lack of affordable housing in the city that's preventing folks from being properly housed in our community, and then I create a program that's built solely around building affordable housing, but I don't factor in all of the other intersections that might also be barriers for people accessing stable housing, like, you know, the racism that they might experience, or the fact that the housing isn't safe if they're women and they've experienced violence before, or that it's not inclusive of the 2S LGBT community. If I don't solve for those equations as well, and I just focus on what I've predetermined to be the correct outcome, my program's going to miss every time, right? And so to me, that's the value of the community-based research, is not only do we hear directly from the people most impacted on what we should be doing, we get to go back to them. And I think that's what's important about what Kathy said too, is that follow-up piece, to go back and say, hey, did we get this right? Are we on the right track here? Would this have better addressed the situation you found yourself in, to know that we're on the right track before we spend a lot of time and energy developing something that ultimately isn't going to impact the problem at its root. That's where I've seen community-based research really be effective.
Shauna, I wonder if you can also speak a little bit to that follow-up and that long-term perspective as someone who's been doing this for a while and has had that follow-up.
I was listening just to the comments people say, and I'm just jotting down, and yeah, follow-up was one, and trust, and you know, the issue of unintended outcomes that you discover that not what you're supposed to be looking for, but you're just blown away. But so all of those things are so important, but follow-up is a really critical one for me. And I think anybody who's doing this kind of work and is invested in it will say that their relationship doesn't start and stop with the research project, right? I mean, so this is the thing, you know, you get a bit of money, say from SSHRC to do some research, and you've got a year to do it, and you do your research, and often that's it. Researchers are gone, they move on to the next project. That's not the way it works in this type of research, or shouldn't work. So, I mean, like I know, you know, all the folks on the panel, but I mean, I've worked with them over many years, and that follow-up piece, I mean, that's how you demonstrate your commitment and your respect for the people that you're working with in the community, that you continue the relationship because you value what they bring to the discussion, and you value their knowledge, you value, or you respect the fact that, you know, the work isn't done at the end of the research. It's then how you use the research to do the advocacy work that you talked about. And so, you know, Kathy, I'm working with Kathy now on a project that relates back to a project that she was involved in that I wasn't involved in, but, you know, knowing that this work still needs to be done. So now, you know, I'm working with her on that project, and it's, again, it's not really a typical thing that researchers often do, because we are kind of confined by this world of, you know, getting on to the next project. But the follow-up is part of building trust, and then also gaining respect and giving back respect.
Michael, I'd be curious, because you work obviously still connected to the local context, but also your work is national in scope. And so how does community and follow-up and all that fit into sort of the work you do?
Yeah, yeah, it is a bit to some extent, and then definitely as a national network connected with my colleagues who are working nationally. Yeah, what I was maybe not directly answering your question, Dagen, but going to say too is, like, I feel like I kind of straddle some of the world of, like, I haven't participated sort of as a researcher from start to finish in a project in the same way that other folks have, but more as an advocate who kind of takes the research and then tries to, like, do something with it to make the change happen, I suppose. So Shauna and I right now are working on a project that she's been sort of the lead researcher, and I've, through my organization, have been the lead sort of community contact, in the way that, like, how our community organizations who are doing really essential or life-saving or work around employment or community services being funded by the provincial government, and how have recent changes from the government over the last 3 or 4 years impacted them. And yeah, sort of like that follow-up too, that has been so great from Shauna, is like understanding to how the research, the product that we'll get, also can be used for our advocacy to get further to the actual change that we want to see. So I think from the relationship that Shauna and I have to like understand the sort of context that we're in, what we might do with that paper, like once it's out there in the world, and where we can go with it, is like really part of the process from the beginning, so that the research actually like has a goal, it has an impact, it doesn't just sort of sit there in the world. And I think that that's really important when, in my mind, when we like talk about follow-up, is that what we want to do with all this research is like see change happen. We want to see whatever government it's targeted at, whatever institution it's targeted at, change something. And that if that sort of is seen as like an outcome or goal too, and the research is tailored or targeted, or it's like at least aware of that advocacy that might follow up, that feels really important to me. As like someone more on the advocacy side of like taking the research and trying to do something. And then at the same time, just to expand on that, I think others have said this, but like, and then those meetings when we're trying to convince a politician who doesn't care about something or is not aware of something, to have that backing and like the credibility that some of that provides is like hugely important, and a huge leg to stand on, to be able to say like, this is what went into this. Here's the knowledge, body of knowledge that is backing up what I'm saying to you right now. And I think that has been like across so much work that I've done, and a variety of different sort of issues and files, having that research to back up what we're saying is like, it's essential. And then the last piece I was going to maybe just responding to the initial question on like what's helpful for our advocacy is, I think it can also end up being like a really good outlet for those in the community maybe who are participating. And I'm thinking particularly of this project that Shauna and I have been working on. And, you know, I think I can speak for many of our members that getting funding from the province or maybe even at the federal level too has been frustrating to fund what they think is really important work. And I think as the researchers who are working on this project in particular, to just be a listening ear for those groups, and then a way for them maybe channel frustration into something bigger or something more. Like these things aren't just your story is going to be added and compiled with others, and then it's going to make some recommendations. It's going to go further than just this conversation. I think is actually a pretty good outlet. So maybe something for me kind of more on that advocacy side is like that sort of listening ear is often can be like really, really crucial for advocacy to know that like you're being heard and that it's going somewhere with what you have to say.
So with all that in mind, because I was checking the time and I want to make sure we have a chance for some Q&A with participants at the end of this as well. I'd love to hear from each of you in a few sentences, a paragraph, what should the next generation of researchers or advocates or activists be mindful of as they try to bridge, you know, the work and academia, and yeah, like what would be your advice to this next generation of researchers and activists coming up?
I can jump in.
Oh, go ahead, Kirsten.
So just like carrying on on the perspective of like the coalition work that I've been involved in, how research like helps with the public policy advocacy piece that we do. Like everybody's kind of touched on this in some ways, but like, so for us, it's helpful in two ways. In one way, it helps like having a community-based process helps to inform what it is that we are even advocating for, right? Like it's not like we're just like random people sitting around the table that are like, well, we should ask the government to do this, you know, like it's we want to genuinely understand like whatever the issue is, whether it's poverty or like housing, we want to really understand that issue that we're exploring from a local level and to understand what the local solutions are and what that change is that needs to happen from a government like public policy perspective. And we can't really get that if we're not looking for those answers in a methodology that isn't community based. And then once we know what the priorities are, then we also sometimes need that research to provide the evidence that supports what it is that we're advocating for, right? And research has been really like, we just Right to Housing right now is pursuing this Keep Public Housing Public campaign where the province is planning to sell off our public housing. We already know, we've identified public housing as being a really important part of addressing poverty and homelessness. And our province wants to sell it. And so we've just finished a partnership with a researcher who's explored what other jurisdictions that have pursued this path of limiting the supply of public housing and what the outcomes have been there. And we're now able to use that research to advocate for why we need to maintain our public housing here in Manitoba and not sell it off. So for the research to be helpful in like those two ways, I think it's like really helpful if that relationship is one where researchers are coming to the communities and the people that are directly connected to the issues that are being explored and be open to learning from them about what the issues are, what we already know about them, right, in the community, and where there are gaps, so that like before we even embark on a research project, we know that it's going to go like down a path where we're asking the right questions and providing answers that we don't already have, and therefore have the research outcome be something that, you know, is helpful in some way to, you know, in our world, this pursuit of social justice. And, you know, if researchers are interested in social justice and contributing to that it really requires them to connect with community very early on in the research project and sort of putting their trust in community to guide and like direct what those research questions need to be. And if that information can be received in a good way, and the research can demonstrate that they respect that information and, you know, intend to actually use it to guide their work, then you can start to build that trust right away with community, and it will make it more likely to have their continued participation along the way. And like, I think it's still okay for researchers to have their own thoughts and ideas and come to community with those, but I think it's really important that they're open to hearing that, you know, it might not be the most helpful direction at this time, and be open to sort of adapting and, you know, shifting where that goes based on what they hear from community.
I would maybe just dovetail a bit off that and say that brings us a bit back to not showing up with the answers already, and understanding that we may not actually have the solutions, right? Even though we may feel we're positioned well to know, unless we have lived expertise, and even still then sometimes we don't have the full picture. And so approaching that research and folks that we're reaching out to with humility, that we don't know, and that they have expertise that we do not hold. And there's been a shift lately that I've really appreciated in our sector, to move from using the language of lived experience to lived expertise, and to valuing people for the knowledge that they carry, because it's knowledge that you know, that I myself may not have as a service worker or service provider, that's critical to the success of any work that I'm doing, any research or any program development that I'm doing. Their expertise is critical to me doing that work well. And then along that same vein, pay people for their time. Right? I'm paid to be at those tables as a researcher, as a programmer, as a executive director, or whatever. And everyone else who's at those tables should also be paid for their time, and paid for their knowledge, and paid for their expertise, and honored in that way. And I think that goes a long way to building trust also. And I think we need to just bear in mind that a lot of the communities we're working with, particularly folks who have been marginalized by systems that we have deliberately set up to fail them, are over-researched. They get researched a lot. And when we don't circle back to show them the outcome of their efforts, when we don't include them in the process at every step of the way, including not just the research, but in the action and advocacy that happens beyond that research, when they aren't given opportunity to own it, to really drive the way it moves forward, we continue to marginalize them. And so that's an important piece of the work, is recognizing that they need to be in control of what that process looks like, and that we need to be humble as we approach it.
Shauna, I know you were going to jump in earlier.
Yeah, well, Kirsten and Lorie pretty much covered it, but I'll just say, you know, that idea of kind of knowing your place, right? So if you're someone who's coming into the research or the community, you're going to do research. You can't just jump in there and start doing research. You have to get to know people. You've got to develop trust. But it's also, as I think both Lorie and Kirsten said, like we bring some knowledge, we bring some skills, but so does everybody else, right? So it's just respecting that the knowledge that each of us bring based on, you know, the experiences that we have, and valuing that, because that's when you get something very valuable, when you recognize, you know, what all of it. I think it's just a far better process. But it's just, you know, in academia, I mean, you know, it's can be challenging. We're teaching students, you know, to, you know, love knowledge, and, you know, you almost like you're creating these, doesn't sound very nice, but little monsters who, you know, think that they know everything and sometimes know more than the next person. And that's just not on, right? Like, that's not the way it should be. So humility, I think Lorie said, is something that we all need to bring to the work.
Glad to know I'm a little monster. That's good. Thank you. Michael or Kathy?
Maybe I'll just quickly add, and then I'll let Kathy have the last word on this one, because yeah, that was similar maybe to what I was going to say, is humility, and then also like knowing the the history that exists before. Like, yeah, hearing Kathy's stories during this panel has just been so interesting to like know what that history of where things are at. And then yeah, I mean, we talked about this beginning, Dagen, but just like I still feel like I'm sort of coming to understand the whole body of like work that exists in this place that has been developed, especially over the last maybe 20 years, by including the folks on this panel. And that can feel maybe overwhelming, but also like to me, that's like those light bulbs in reading and being part of events like this has been sort of what started me on the trajectory where I'm at. So that humility and like knowing the history feels really important. And then maybe one other like kind of sometimes specific piece, but like sort of understanding maybe what are the limitations of the community partner. And I think in this, I mean, especially like politically, like what are, and that could maybe mean like, what are things that they maybe can't say or like would have a hard time saying because of things like funding, but also maybe what role do you have like as a researcher in sort of like some freedom for them in sort of the lack or like the step away that you are from them in being able to say things or put ideas out there maybe that they can't or that they're limited in saying. So maybe something to think about of like what sort of power do you have in the role that you might be as a researcher in either yeah, sort of being aware of some of those limitations and what role you might play in being able to put knowledge out there in the world.
Are we all still here?
You betcha. Take us home.
Well, thanks, Michael. I like your honesty. And you know, just listening to you talk, Michael, especially when you first introduced yourself as a settler, I found that very endearing, but also a little on the funny side, because back in the day, I had never heard that word before, being identified as a settler. And I just sort of noticed the word when it started to pop up with a lot of young people who are finally realizing whose land they're on. And I like to also see that a lot of the universities and a lot of the institutions are actually, hopefully they mean it truly mean it, that they know which land they're on, right? And yeah, so I like those ideas, and I think that for me, communication has always been a real issue for a lot of us, and you know, a lot of us, English is not our first language. As a child, I spoke Ojibwe until I started school here in the city, kindergarten, and my mother told me that I picked up English very fast. Oh, I had to survive, right? My brother too also was like that. And so yeah, I think that like I said before, follow-up is so important if you can really you know, look at what needs to be followed up and how do we do that, and who's going to do that, and why are we going to do that. You know, I think once you can answer all that, you'll know exactly what to do when you have to do that follow-up. And I would say to advice to some of you newer folks who are starting to do research, to really become a good facilitator. Facilitation is a skill. I learned facilitation only by doing it, because there was no YouTube stuff to look at, nothing in books to look at. And, you know, I had other women that I saw as facilitators, and I learned from them. And I also did a course one summer from Winnipeg, Jim Silver's found myself facilitating the students. I was not the person there to fill up their knowledge. I had 3 Indigenous students and all the rest were non-Indigenous. I only had one guy drop out, but the rest stayed in. And I had to smile when one of the women students said, if there's only one thing I learned in this class, was that food is so important. Feasting is so important to celebrate. And because we never did a lot of that feasting, the work that we did in the 1980s and 90s. And but then we started to do a little more work on feeding ourselves. But we never had anybody to facilitate. We never had the leader to say who's going to bring what food and what not. So what happens when you're a busy person like we were back in those days, young mothers, we had husbands, boyfriends, whatever, we would end up with a lot of salads because it was so easy to make, and that was our feast of salads. But those relationship building that we did within our own group, it's really important to feast, say thank you to each other. Yeah, that's all of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for the advice and the answers. I think we've got about 10 minutes, so we will do a little bit of questions and answers. So if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. The first one was John Sears asked, how do CBR practitioners respond to questions about and push back on the robustness of participatory research approaches? And Shauna, I don't know if you want to take that on.
Sure. So the good news, John, is I think it's getting a bit easier. And I think it's partly because, the big grant, funding agencies are wanting to see more research that's engaging with communities. And I think they are also people are becoming a little bit more sophisticated around community-based research, recognizing that community-based research isn't about going into a community and doing some sort of research and then leaving the community, because communities are themselves just not accepting that model. And Kathy spoke to that herself. So I think it's actually it's becoming more respected. So I know, like, I'm involved in a big, some of us here, a research grant that we received, like our Assured Partnership grants, all, focuses on community-based research. And we received funding for that. And, some of us try to publish. I mean, we do the publications for community that communicate, has ownership over, because, that is important. But it doesn't mean you can't always then do a journal article, because that is the expectation of university researchers. So you can do both of those things, I believe. So, and there's always going to be people who don't appreciate the kind of work that we do, but, that's always, that's the reality in academia always, with all kinds of research. Quantitative researchers, dismiss qualitative research, and qualitative researchers, criticize quantitative. There's all sorts of different methods being used in community-based research. So I think, its legitimacy is really coming into its own, I feel. So I don't know if that helps, but I feel fairly optimistic about it.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is from Janice Tilley. Have there been situations where there's been a difference within the community of what the outcome should be, and how as a researcher do you navigate such a situation?
I don't want to answer all the questions, so I'm going to point my finger at Lorie, because I bet you Lorie could answer this question. Well, because Lorie kind of touched on it. That's why I'm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely disagreement in community, and I think We saw some of this in our developing of our housing strategy, where both at the service provider table and across between the service provider table and the first voice advisory circle, there was disagreement on the way forward and what the right answers and what the right solutions are to be. And so at some point you got to make some decisions. And so for us, it was about prioritizing first the first voice experience and making sure that they were centered in the report, and that most of the recommendations that came out of the report were rooted in what they told us. And then there was negotiation that happened, right? And that isn't always, they're not always easy conversations. And to be honest, the more inclusive the table and the more you strive towards consensus, the slower your process is going to be. But I would argue that also the better your outcome will be, because if you can work to bring everyone along with you as you develop a project or recommendations, and you have everyone's buy-in by the end, even if they don't, they maybe wouldn't have chosen 100% of the outcomes, but they can at least live with the outcome, then ultimately you're going to succeed more. And we saw, we kind of just, we were very fortunate that we had a funder when we were doing our project that let us be really flexible with our timelines. So many times when we said our report was going to be done, it was like, oh, we're going to need another 3 more months, because we'd hit a snag around an issue that was important enough for us to dive deep into it and really make sure that everyone's perspective had been heard and that we went forward in a good way. And I think the report that was produced demonstrates that commitment. And I think the folks with lived expertise that were at the table with us felt that commitment. And to this day, we don't even have the project funding anymore, but that first voice advisory circle is still with us actioning that report. So I think their commitment to the outcome is a clear demonstration that we got it right. So
I'd just like to say, Lorie, I certainly do support what you're saying, and I learned the hard way on consensus. Consensus is a traditional kind of decision making in our community, and we were doing that very important work in child welfare back in the 1980s when we developed the Mama Wichita Center. We had a coalition, and our coalition split right in half. Women who wanted to go ahead and wait to develop a children's aid society filled with a lot of brown faces, and there was the other side of the coalition said, no, we've got to take this $1 million and we've got to develop some kind of a resource center of sorts to help our families who are losing children to the child welfare system. That split lasted a long time. I'd say maybe 10 years. A lot of us didn't talk to each other. But a lot of healing had to take place after that split. And that was the hard way that I learned consensus-based decision making. So that's my story on that one.
Dagen, can I just quickly respond to John's follow-up comment?
Go
Because I
for
think
it.
it was really important. So John's follow-up comment was that, so having an impact with policymakers. John, there's so many elements that go into having an impact, right? But one of them is that community ownership of the research that then leads to the organizing. And so Kirsten talked a little bit about that in terms of Make Poverty History. I mean, and it's also the case that, it depends which government's in power. And so there's all those things. But I feel that, it really is, you can have all the evidence in the world of something that you want to do, but unless we have to fight for stuff all the time. And so if you've got the buy-in because people feel it's their research, then having people rally around it, you're just more likely to be effective. So I don't know if that helps, but.
And then Michael, I know you wanted to jump in at one point as well. I just want to circle back to you as well.
Sure, maybe answers a little bit of both, but I think on the advocacy side, there's work that we need to do when we're fighting for that is really making the case. But I think also I think maybe Kirsten and I have been part of some of these meetings when a politician has been community, who do you mean, who's the community that you're talking about here? So I think it's important, at least in our advocacy, to like strike a balance between, you know, recognizing like not 100% of people in a community or in society will ever agree to something, as maybe folks have outlined how hard consensus is, and that's okay. Like, so to not necessarily like totally exaggerate that on the advocacy side, and then how that's reflected in the research with like, as the research methods are presented in the paper, like what the limitations maybe were. I think that's totally okay, because I think politicians will quickly kind of see through to be like 100% of people everywhere across the city agree with this. They won't buy that. So I think it's totally fine to like present what goes into the research methods, whether it's like quantitative or qualitative question, or whether it's around this like who all, like how much consensus did you get around something. I think it's good to be honest about that. It actually supports your advocacy when they trust that you're presenting the truth or the opinions that did come, rather than exaggerating.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Kathy, Kirsten, Lorie, Shauna, Michael, for your time. It's very much appreciated. Thank you to everyone who came out. I'll find where this video is going to live of the recorded discussion. I will also try to transcribe it. So if you missed any sections, you'll be able to read through it. I know for myself, that's sometimes far more accessible. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming out today. And yeah, have a great week.